enthusiasm is just bubbling over. Could be a wacky weekend if we get snow and all that, like I said. This is right. On Wednesday, we were talking about the beginnings of the New Deal. And as I pointed out, one of the first things Roosevelt addressed was direct relief to those in need. A lot of people out there were starving, they were homeless, they were without hope. So they create one of the first of the, let's see if I have white chalk. First of the so-called alphabet agencies. FARA, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. And that would provide $500 million in relief to those in need. By the way, I mentioned Harry Hopkins on Wednesday, the head of FARA. Here's Harry. He's one of the great unsung heroes of the New Deal and World War II. Now, there were numerous New Deal agencies. Many were designed to aid a particular segment of the economy or the population. Remember, the progressives had kind of pioneered that in a way. One was the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the AAA. Has nothing to do with automobiles. The Agricultural Adjustment Act. Remember, one of the problems that led to the Depression was overproduction. America's farms had been way too efficient and productive. More pigs, more cows than the economy could absorb. And what's that going to do to the price of farm commodities with all this overproduction?
Drive down.
Thank you. It's going to drive down. Good morning. Unfortunately, the response by American farmers was to produce even more, further addressing the price. So the idea under the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, was to soak up this surplus, eliminate it, and let the market prices rise for agricultural goods. They were going to pay farmers not to grow. This is the origin of farm subsidies. And I always thought that that would be a perfect job to have. Be a farmer and get paid by the government not to grow. Actually, they still do it today. Now, there's a problem. There's a surplus already out there. What are you going to do with it? What are you going to do with the excess milk, the wheat, the corn? That would be the ideal thing to do, and today we could handle that. Back then, they didn't have the infrastructure. The government simply did not have the workers, the warehouses, the transportation facilities. So unfortunately, they paid farmers to destroy much of it. That, in many ways, did not help the image of the New Deal early. It was one of the few things that didn't. I mean, there were newsreels of farmers pouring milk out onto the ground, and the people watching it, were half starved. But they just didn't have the infrastructure. Like I said, today, they were able to redistribute it. Back then, they couldn't. It ultimately worked, though. It does raise farm prices. Another was the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC. One of the problems was the large number of unemployed young men. You've got people graduating from high school, graduating from college, with no jobs and little opportunity to get one. In a lot of urban areas and even some rural areas, this was becoming a problem. A lot of these young men were getting turned to petty crime and other things because they were hopeless, especially in the summer and especially in the larger cities. So they created the Civilian Conservation Corps. The idea was to get young men out of the cities and into the countryside on government projects. They would work on forestry, they would work on developing farmland, on irrigation projects.
Morning.
Good morning. They would spend several months in a CCC camp, normally over the summer, get them off the streets. They would get paid a small wage, usually about $10 or $12 a month. And if you were under 18, that went home to your parents. But you got 3 hots and a cot, 3 good hot meals a day, and roof over your head and all that. And for many of these urban youth that went to the CCC camps, it was a life-changing experience. To begin with, they provided educational opportunities. A lot of these kids hadn't finished high school, some hadn't finished grade school. That was a lot more common back then than you would think. The CCC had educational camps. You could get, good morning, you could get the equivalent of your GED in a CCC camp. See how many more acronyms I can use in a sentence. Secondly, for a lot of these urban kids growing up in an inner city and all that, they're surrounded by a forest. When most of their life they had never seen 2 trees together. So a lot of them developed a love of nature and an appreciation for it. And the other thing, it was good exercise. It was healthy, got them out doing things, it was constructive, and it did keep the crime rate down in the cities. By the way, ladies, you notice I keep mentioning young men. There weren't CCC camps for young women. You know why? You guys weren't a crime problem. They weren't worried about gangs of young women running around New York City. They were worried about young guys. We're the troublemaker. Young guys are the troublemaker. I'm no longer young enough to be a troublemaker. Oops, not right for that yet. Another was the Public Works Administration, the PWA. By the way, getting the hint of why these are called alphabet agencies, you got the FERA, the AAA, CCC, the PWA, and there's a bunch more to come, folks. They're going to use the whole darn alphabet. The Public Works Administration had a $4 billion budget for massive public works. Building dams, building government buildings, building roads. One of the projects that was completed under it was Hoover Dam out west. Another New Deal reform, and this one isn't exactly an alphabet agency, the Home Owners Loan Act. It was to help people that were struggling paying their mortgages. Now, critics dubbed it the Real Estate Agent Bailout Act, but it really did bail out many homeowners in America. It's been estimated that it helped save nearly a third of the mortgaged homes in America. 1 out of 3 people that had a mortgage benefited from the Homeowners Act, Homeowners Loan Act. Now, not all New Deal programs worked well. Some of them did, few of them didn't. Keep in mind they're experimenting. They're throwing things up against the wall, seeing what sticks, and then expanding that, and if it doesn't work, they're going to get rid of it and try something else. But not all of them work. One of them that had decidedly mixed results was the NRA. That has nothing to do with rifles. It's the National Recovery Administration. The NRA was government support and loans to business, and also allowed business to cooperate to cut down on wasteful competition. Basically, a suspension of the anti-monopoly laws. It was an attempt to kickstart American industry. Membership was voluntary. Remember Hoover had tried voluntary programs early on? You even see some of that in the New Deal. Not all the programs are mandatory. There's still this sense of voluntarism, for example. So you didn't have to join the NRA if you didn't want to. There were requirements if you joined. Member organizations had to pay a government-stipulated minimum wage if you're a member of the NRA. Also, you were not allowed to racially discriminate, according to the guidelines anyway. And there were other things you had to follow. But by and large, there were a lot of benefits from it, particularly low-interest government loans, things like that, and the suspension of the anti-monopoly laws. Now, by May of 1935, roughly 2 years after its passage, it had raised industrial production by about 55%. So it was successful in that area. But it turned out to be a failure in many others. To begin with, it was headed by a former Army general, Hugh S. Johnson. Johnson had the experience and knowledge for the job. He didn't have the personality. He's a general. He's used to giving orders. When you're dealing with the corporate heads of General Electric or Westinghouse or DuPont, you don't give corporate executives orders. You work with them. He was arrogant. He was abrasive. I mean, don't get me wrong, he was hardworking and dedicated, but he lacked the people skills for the job. And he also developed, unfortunately, a drinking problem. Secondly, the government had little way to enforce the regulations. Congress had empowered the National Recovery Administration, but they really didn't have any enforcement mechanisms. So a company could sign up and get the Blue Eagle, which was very important. That was the symbol of the NRA. You got this real serious looking eagle, don't you? Lightning bolts in one hand. And by the way, for industry, you got a gear in the other. For businesses, this was excellent publicity, especially if you're a small business. The NRA applied, to General Electric and also the mom and pop grocery store down the road. So having this in your store window was very good for business. The trouble is people would would sign up, join the NRA, get the benefits from it, and then fail to follow any of the regulations, especially down south. Remember, you weren't supposed to discriminate in job hiring. They routinely did in the southern states. Many of the businesses that signed up did not pay the mandated minimum wage, for example. African Americans were so dismayed with it, they said that NRA stood for Negroes Ruined Again. Luckily for Roosevelt, in many ways, in May of 1935, the Supreme Court found aspects of the NRA unconstitutional, particularly the part about the anti-monopoly exemptions. As one critic put it, the Blue Eagle had become a sick chicken. And the NRA kind of started fading out after that. They kind of winded it down. So it's one of the, to say the least successful programs. Now some have problems in the beginning and then right themselves, like the AAA. The adverse publicity of destroying all that food undermined it at first, and also the fact that a lot of Southerners were taking advantage of the compensation they were getting. Tenant farming was the norm down south. Usually had large plantation owners that would rent out usually about 50 acres of land to small tenant farmers. And the vast majority, not all by any means, but the vast majority of tenant farmers were African American. The plantation owners wanted to keep all of the subsidies for themselves. Under the law, technically, they were supposed to share it with their sharecroppers. So instead of sharing it, they just forced them off the land so they didn't have to deal with them. The New Dealers were aware of that, and they fixed it with something known as the Farm Tenancy Act. Now, all of these displaced tenant farmers could now get a low or no interest government loan to buy their own land. And the government bought up farmland in the South to sell to the displaced farmers. So some of these programs had flaws in the beginning, but whenever possible, it wasn't always possible, but whenever possible, they went out of their way to try and fix them, to right wrongs. Now, the success of many of these programs had to do with the people running them. Many of them are extremely talented. One of FDR's great skills, and most like FDR, had cut their teeth during the progressive movement. And they still believed in a lot of those progressive principles. Like the old progressives, they were dedicated idealists and wanted to use the government to help society. Now, they had their faults. Many of them were rather arrogant and self-righteous. You get a little pushy at times. But much like the old progressives, they were money honest. It was very hard to corrupt any of them. FDR will be president longer than any person in American history. He'll be president for over 12 years. And there were no, and I mean no, major scandals during any of his administrations. No major scandals at all. The worst one involved his former campaign manager influence as postmaster general. That was it. He wasn't ever convicted of anything, but Roosevelt requested he leave office. That was the closest thing to a scandal in 12 years. So by and large, the New Dealers from top to bottom, like I said, they had their faults, but corruption wasn't one of them. They tended to be young. Many of them were in their 30s and 40s. And given the power many of them wielded, they were awfully young. But it also gave them a sense of optimism and a lot of energy. They were enthusiastic about what they were doing, ready to tackle it. They were far more diverse in terms of gender, race, and occupation than previous American administrations. They didn't have your usual list of suspects holding office. They weren't just lawyers and businessmen. They came from a wide variety of fields. Harry Hopkins, he wasn't a lawyer or a businessman. He was a trained social worker. You're going to see more women in government than ever before. FDR will appoint the first woman to the cabinet. Frances Perkins will become her Secretary of Labor, his Secretary of Labor. She is not a token appointment. She is an old friend and close advisor to FDR, and she will be a major voice not only in the New Deal, but also during World War II. She'll be one of his major advisors during the war. So she is a powerful force in the New Deal. She is not a token. Now, having said that, she will be the only woman named to a presidential cabinet during FDR's tenure. So it's a milestone. She's the first. She plays a key role, but keep in mind, it's still limited. She's the only one. Now, as far as women, no woman was more important to the New Deal than Eleanor. She not only advised Franklin and often pressured him on social justice issues, she was also the visible face of the New Deal. As FDR told her, she was the, quote, leg of the administration. FDR was busy in Washington and was not particularly mobile back then anyway. Remember, he's in a wheelchair. He doesn't travel that much, at least early on. So it's Eleanor that becomes the face for the New Deal to the American public. And it's perfect. She's caring and it shows. She's honest. She's open. She's concerned about the average American. And when she tours the country, she does and prominent people. She talks to the average person. She talks to workers in factories, to clerks in stores. There's even a cartoon that was published during the New Deal. Several women, such as educator Mary McLeod Bethune, head New Deal. at that point, she was America's leading female journalist. And she did hard news. She interviewed people like the dictator of Italy, Benito Mussolini. This is a day and age where women reporters normally did society news. Oh, Mrs. Jones held a tea on Sunday for 50 people. So Hickok was doing hard news. She was just as good or better a journalist than any man out there. She was also one of Eleanor's closest friends in the world. And Harry Hopkins sent her out to basically gauge whether the New Deal was working from the ground up. By the way, I don't know if it's, you can probably get it on Amazon, but a lot of her reports back to Hopkins and FDR have been put together in a book called One Third of a Nation. And if you really want to get an idea of what the Depression was like and what the New Deal was trying to do to affect it, if you're that interested in it, find a copy of it. It's a great book. And again, to show you the diversity in the New Deal, Hickok was gay. In his hiring choices or anything like that. So again, you see a little more diversity that you don't see in previous. FDR will also name still mid-level positions. None of them are senior level. But several members of the Black Family do go on in life to much senior positions. Two in particular I need to mention. One of them, who worked in the Justice Department, William Hastie, will go on to become the Honorable William Hastie, the first African-American federal judge in history. And the second was an economist who worked for the Commerce Department, Robert Weaver, Dr. Robert Weaver. "30 years later, under Lyndon Johnson, he will become the first African-American to sit in a presidential cabinet. He will be named Secretary of HUD, Housing and Urban Development, by Lyndon Johnson. So at least two of the black cabinet go on to very prominent federal jobs. Now, as I want to point out, these are advances, but they're still limited. When it came to African Americans, Roosevelt made sure that black Americans were included in all the programs. But to get them passed, we had to satisfy conservative white senators. So all the New Deal programs were sent to white. But it halts the crisis and the downward spiral. The U.S. economy had hit its lowest point in March of 1933, when Roosevelt was inaugurated. Beginning with the New Deal, it will begin to rise. It'll start to expand again. But it doesn't end the depression. Secondly, it restores hope. A lot of Americans were literally running out of hope and options. The New Deal renewed their faith and gave them hope that life might actually be better in the future. And before I forget, talking about life being better, brought in one of the reproduction headlines again. This one from April 7th, 1933, when Prohibition ended. And you can get a good idea how the good city of Cincinnati felt about the return of beer. Were extremely popular with those. American public appreciated what they do, and many people will. Now, didn't like that. Poor loved them. Yeah.
Rich.
They were trying to do something for them. Thank you. The wealthy classes. My God, they were appalled at all this. How dare the government help the poor and starving? Especially with our money. The Roosevelts were considered traitors to their class. By the way, it was a charge that the Roosevelts were proud of. But yes, the upper class weren't particularly popular. Remember, they weren't feeling the effects of the New Deal, of the Depression. They were fine. But the New Deal was shaking up the social order. They'd rather let people starve than jeopardize their own social. beginning with the New Deal, African Americans will shift their political allegiance from the party of Lincoln to the Democratic Party. Now, since Reconstruction, African Americans had largely voted Republican, and for good reason. Throughout the 19th century, at least, the Democrats were the party of racism. That began to change with the progressives, at least in the North. Doesn't change much in the South for a while. Black people had voted Republican historically because it was the only party that offered them anything. And they didn't offer them much. Wendell Phillips Dabney, Republican, was leading African American newspapers. And then the Republicans switched to a Democrat and said it in an editorial. So the only reason, one of the reasons I'm doing this is because the Republican Party only cared about voters on 2 days of the year. The day before an election and election. It was turning his allegiance now to the New Deal. And a lot of other African American folks the same way. The Democratic Party was changed. Roosevelt was doing more for the black community than any president since Lincoln. So you see a historic shift in voting patterns. African Americans in 1932 had voted overwhelmingly for Hoover. In 1936, they will vote overwhelmingly for FDR. And to this day, African Americans have remained a staunch component of the Democratic coalition. So one of the effects of the New Deal and Roosevelt was a historic shift in black voting patterns. This didn't hurt either, by the way. I pointed out, though, a lot we're still segregated. This is a CCC project for black veterans of the Great War. And here are many members of the Black Cabinet. As I pointed out, many of them will go on to great prominence. Now, after the so-called first 100 days, Roosevelt begins to become more passive. They had passed a variety of reforms in all different areas, and they wanted to see what was working and what wasn't. So the pace of reform slackens greatly after the first 3.5, 4 months. They want to see how things are going. Though most people were happy with the New Deal, it had its critics from the right and the left. One of them was a Catholic priest who had a radio program, Father Charles Coughlin, the so-called radio priest. Now, he had a parish excuse me, in suburban Detroit. And he had originally gone on the radio to preach and to bring Sunday Mass to people that couldn't make it to church. Excuse me. But as the Depression began to deepen, Coughlin began to work in social commentary and his sermons. And eventually, he became more of a social commentator than a religious pundit on the radio. Initially, he had supported the New Deal. But he had become increasingly enamored with right-wing politics, particularly Italian fascism under Benito Mussolini, and was also becoming a rabid anti-Semite. What do I mean by that? What is anti-Semitism?
Anti-Jew.
Thank you. Bigotry against Jews. Thank you. He began criticizing the New Deal vehemently, especially for its inclusion of Jews. On the radio, he routinely referred to it as the Jew Deal. So he became a bitter opponent of the New Deal from the right. As I pointed out, Roosevelt got it from both directions. On the left, he's attacked by the governor or senator from the great state of Louisiana, Huey P. Long. Long was a very popular but extremely corrupt governor of Louisiana. And when I say extremely corrupt, I am not joking. He initially supported the New Deal, hoping to get something out of it, in particular a cabinet position. But Roosevelt was smart enough to keep Long at arm's length. He realized he was corrupt. He didn't want that in his administration. So when Long didn't get the cabinet position he desired, he turned on him. It was obvious he was going to run for president in 1936 in opposition. He started promoting his own program. Share our wealth. Long attacked the New Deal, said it hadn't gone far enough. Through his program, he wanted to confiscate every portion over $1 million. Long will be the victim of his own corruption. He had a lot of trophies and crimes, and like a lot of criminals, screwed them over too. One of them was shooting dead on the set branded actors and actors. Many of them had retirement plans, but the company they worked for had gone bankrupt. Where the government would pay everyone over 60 $200 a month. That'd be a pretty good income back then, $2,400 a year. The catch was the recipients had to spend it all that month. Didn't matter how you spent it, but you had to spend it all. The idea was to help out senior citizens and stimulate the economy. And quite frankly, theoretically, it wasn't a it would have done what by the way, that's what saved him in retirement. He could live off the dues he collected from the council collector. Now, as I pointed out, it was unrealistic and probably too expensive, but it put pressure on FDR to do something. And here's our good Dr. Townsend. And notice he was pretty long living. There's a guy from the pressure from the right, the pressure from the left, and legitimate pressure from people like Townsend and others, plus the fact that Roosevelt was now eyeing re-election, which was ironic because even as county. It's more like the 240 days. That doesn't have the same ring to it, does it? Nah, not as catchy. So the second New Deal is often known as the second 100 days. Roosevelt's reacting to criticism, not so much Long or Coughlin, but legitimate criticism, like Townsend. And he had more reforms he wanted to implement. He had had enough time to assess the first wave of the New Deal projects to see what was working, see what wasn't working, and what they had left to do. And he pointed out he wants to get reelected. So, on Monday, we will look at the second New Deal